The biggest one, and this is the one that my Animal Crossing experience fell in, is unbalanced choices. In systems where some choices are just clearly better than other choices in almost all regards, the actual breadth of choices, the actual breadth of deciding things in the game kind of diminishes. As certain things are just completely eclipsed by others. And this can be hindered especially by some choices having lack of feedback or being especially complicated, because you can actually have systems that are balanced, but if players can't puzzle that out from their current knowledge, then they'll end up just sticking with things that it might as well be unbalanced. So there's my poor little Fisher fella. Definitely one impact of this is that you get a lot of wasted assets. There's all sorts of great, probably, stuff in Animal Crossing that I'll never see. And it's because of the way that the game was balanced. It also can result in a lot of really boring min-max playing. A great example of this is the old brawling games in arcades like Double Dragon, which are fun, especially with other people. But if you actually watch players play them, these games, which, like, to describe them, basically you just walk from the left to the right and you punch people in the face, which is, fun. But they would often brag about the number of karate moves in the game. Oh, there's 15 moves, there's 25 moves, there's 35 moves. But if you actually watch players play, in almost all circumstances, they'll fiddle through all 35 moves and then find out one particular kick is the best kick. And then the entire game is them just doing that one kick. Okay, so did that game have 35 choices? It did at first. It was fun to explore them, but ultimately, no, it seems not to actually encourage them. And the reality is almost all games suffer from unbalance. It's really, really hard to know what will happen in systems in motion once you let them loose in the wild. All you can do is watch people. But it still requires a certain amount of balance for people to maintain interest. And one other category is just extraneous choices. Giving people too much to take care of it or keep track of it, especially when there's not strong differentiation between choices, can end up removing the interest or the effectiveness of different choices. An example of that might be a card game that might have 500 cards for you to choose from, all of which are subtly different. It can be fun if you're a gearhead, if you love the different kinds of cards, but for a lot of players, all that is confusing. It's distracting. It's kind of noise from what is the core of what they're interested in, which is racing around a circle very quickly. Same thing with guns in some military games, where some people are going to be interested in 300 types of guns. A lot of players really could take 3 and be fine with them. A great example of that actually is in first-person shooters a lot of times. Some maneuvers like ducking or jumping don't actually have points. They were added because all first-person shooters have ducking and jumping, but it turns out that they just end up being keys that someone has to learn or memorize and then forget about. There's no way to know, of course, when you're starting the game that, okay, this was added because we felt like we needed to add it, but we're not going to use it. And it's not always ducking or jumping or whatever. Depending on the game, it can always be different kinds of things. Okay, so here I am bashing ways of implementing choices, but choices are, of course, absolutely vital to games. That's what makes games games. It's interactive media, right? So what my thinking, where my head is right now, is that the key to keeping games really interesting is modulating where the choices are, what kind of choices are being made, making sure that there's diversity in the kind of choices that are happening over the course of the game. So I'm going to look at, instead of some categories, I'm going to look at a handful of games that I think do really interesting things in that space. So I'm going to start with actually not even a video game, and this is not a game I'm an expert at all, but I find it as a game designer really interesting. Magic the Gathering. Basically, the gameplay, if you're not familiar with it, you assemble a deck of collectible cards. Each of them have different properties. And a lot of the gameplay is this interesting offline component where you're preparing to play against other people. You collect your resources, all your cards, and you pull different cards into your deck to assemble the best strategic deck. No one card is best. Some of them are appropriate for early games, some of them are appropriate for later in the game, some of them are appropriate against certain other kinds of players. All right, so this part's pretty deterministic. You own certain stuff, you build what you think is optimal. But what Magic does to make things more interesting is add some randomness. You draw cards the same way that you might in playing poker. And so part of what you have to plan for when you build your deck is recognizing that you don't get to pick when you get access to what resources. So you have less choice there in a certain way, in the framework I'm talking about. But what that does is it demands that you build new strategies out of the resources you have when you draw them. And this means that you get a lot more diversity out of play and a lot more diversity from even 2 matches against the same person using the same decks. And obviously Magic has been extremely popular for a long time and similar collectible card games. So. Another game I think that it does some really interesting, it does all sorts of interesting things, but specifically for this is Super Mario Brothers, especially 3 and Super Mario World. One thing that they do in those games that's really interesting is instead of having a character class or having a set of properties, what the player does is they'll alternate between different forms. So, for example, you might be the Frog Mario, or you might be the Fire Mario, or the Raccoon Mario. And Raccoon Mario can fly, of course. And Frog Mario can swim really well, but is very slow on land. And so there's this kind of interesting identity swapping that happens where the player might be going through a level as Frog Mario and then find out, because it's mostly water, and then find out this is really hard. It's great in the water, but at the very end, there's that part that I just can't get past. Maybe I'll try being fiery instead. And so the way that they modulate the choice is in these clusters, these clumps. You take the good and the bad, this entire identity of a Mario that's appropriate possibly for different situations, and you swap them out if one isn't working. And interestingly, it's kind of like going to a pizza place, that a lot of places will let you assemble your own pizza, but they also give you some kind of specialty pizzas. And if you go and you're given just tons of ingredients, it's not too uncommon to be like, well, I like pepperoni, I like onions, that's what I want. But given the choice of specific combinations of things that work well together, you might be far more inclined to try out different things because you know that each of these might be interesting. So I think that's an interesting way of modulating choice. Halo gets rid of kind of the inventory issue, and what I mean by that is both with inventories and abilities, a lot of times, you're forced in situations as a game designer to have players have access to everything all the time. And so any problem they come across, they're going to solve it in probably fairly similar ways because they always have access to everything they can ever do. Is that 10 left? Okay. That means 10 left? Okay. I'll be fine. So part of the problem there, though, is that this can be a lot of information overload. If you always have access to everything, then you've got to remember in every situation, okay, which thing should I be using here? What Halo does is they say you can carry two things. And when you kill enemies, a lot of times they'll drop stuff. And so the player never really has to think about more than anything other than, I've got these two things, which of them should I use? And the weapons are extremely well differentiated, much better than they were in a Soldier of Fortune. But what happens because of this is, as mentioned, players don't have to remember what weapon they ought to pull out from their giant inventory. But on top of that, it's actually pretty satisfying to retry different scenarios. If you go into one with two weapons and it doesn't work out well, because it saves about every 2 minutes, it's not uncommon to think, okay, about 15 feet back there was that other weapon. Maybe I'll swap that out. Maybe this pair of weapons will be a really interesting way to solve this problem. So in some ways, it's like Soldier of Fortune's mistake, but it seems like the granularity, the frequency that you can change those weapons makes it really pretty interesting. So another game in a very different direction that I think does some interesting things in this space is Frogger. And a lot of old arcade games do similar things. The point of Frogger is, of course, to get your frog up to those holes up there for whatever reason. But they're safe. They're happy places. And this seems like the sort of situation where somebody could optimize it and just do boring, repetitive things very easily. But what Frogger will do is they'll add little flies, I think, or some other things to specific spots in the level fairly randomly. And suddenly, what you're up to, what your goals are, shift because where the important resources are in the world shift around. They just fluctuate. And so this keeps players, I think, basically just reevaluating a lot more. It's not so easy to make one boring, obvious thing that works when certain resources that you care about have a lot more fluctuation to them. A great example, and I have a really sad little thought experiment here, but a great example is Tetris. Tetris gives you the blocks. You don't get to choose those. You don't get to place them. And in the scheme I'm kind of been talking about, we can all imagine what Tetris would be like if you added player choice by letting the player pick what the next piece would be. It would not be a game. You disrupt the long piece that you always want anyway, and then after about a minute and a half, you'd think, this is very boring. I will never play this again. So it seems like the right kinds of constraints. The player gets to choose things. That's the interesting part. Choose where to put things. I mean, that's what makes Tetris such an interesting and addictive game. And one thing that's really noteworthy, I think, is that you can see in this example, the diversity comes from the playfield, not from the controls. The controls are extremely simple. But it's the rising, evolving floor underneath you that makes the game consistently interesting. Choice of where to put things as the floor changes is what's interesting about this game. And I think Mario, too, they embed a lot of the interest in the environment rather than the player, and it's very similar. They have a lot more control that way of making sure that players are up to interesting things instead of sort of falling into deviant circles. And one final game I want to look at is Street Fighter 3, although a lot of other one-on-one fighting games have similar things. This is a typical game with two angry people punching each other in the face, much like Double Dragon. But one thing that they do that's very different is they provide this idea of parrying. And what parrying does, the mechanic of parrying, is if someone attacks you and you've guessed what they're going to do, you sort of sidestep it and then you can punish them. So what's interesting about this mechanic is no particular move is the best move. Just the act of being repetitive is the bad move. Being too predictable is what will get you punished, not choosing a weak move. And so Street Fighter 3 has a kind of interesting self-balancing aspect to it because of this. Okay, so I'm not saying that the games I just covered there cover every interesting way of modulating player choice, of course. That's way too big. But it kind of points, I think, in a kind of a more of a mental framework of things that people can do to sort of fiddle with things to avoid things like my Animal Crossing situation. So one thing we're definitely seeing here is that discrete properties can help players manage choice. The players in Mario know the 4 or 5 suits. They don't have to know that there's 7 properties, each of which can be fiddled with. Same thing with Halo's weapons. Time-sensitive resources, much like the little treats in Frogger there, and you can find similar things in Robotron and Centipede and a lot of older arcade games where you're suddenly, pushed in the situation of doing what you thought you were doing, or shifting and taking advantage of something that has a limited duration. That seems to keep players more interested. Playfield differences seem to be a really good way of preventing optimal choices. That's specifically what Mario and Tetris do well. Specifically, what Double Dragon was not doing particularly well, since the world doesn't really matter. It definitely seems to be the case that properly applied, randomness can do all sorts of things to diversify people's strategy and keep them interested for much longer when they play games. Magic, of course, is a great example of this, and as mentioned, Tetris only exists because of it. And finally, self-balancing systems also seem to have the potential to be a lot more robust and interesting. Definitely the case of Street Fighter 3 and some other fighting games, but it's definitely, I think, an area that could be explored a lot more. And so, in closing, at least from my perspective, choices should be encouraging diversification of action. It's not really about how many choices you have, it's how many choices you use. And they need to always be evaluated systemically. To evaluate this stuff, you have to say not that fishing should be present in the game or not. That's not a meaningful statement. But rather, what's the role of fishing in the context of all the other things that I can do in Animal Crossing. So that's the presentation. Thanks a lot.